total stranger to the Bible would be very confused when reading it, probably by the many different complicated subjects and themes. However, one such complication is the role of Israel in the story. The Old Testament seems like it's all about Israel and the Jews. God talks about how he's going to bless them, how the family of Abraham is going to be a blessing to the entire world. He's going to heal the nation and bring them back into himself, etc. And yet, if you fast forward from there and look at the church today, you'd realize that God's plans for Israel have not come true. In fact, Israel plays very little role in much of our lives today. And instead, God has been doing something completely different, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ across the known world, including tons of people who aren't Jewish. This is a question that I think a lot of us have, but we don't know that we have it. There seems to be this disconnect between the way that the Old Testament talks about Israel and the way the New Testament talks about Jesus. Personal morality, personal salvation, and tons of other people groups. How do these things connect or relate? This is one of the main reasons that Paul wrote his epistle to the Romans. The church in Rome was made up of both Jewish and Gentile Christians who disagreed on how to practice their faith. Paul made it his mission in his letter to clear up these disagreements and explain the relationship between the Jewish race and practicing faith in Jesus. The first 8 chapters of the book handle the subjects of sin, the law, and justification. His point is that all are sinners and that the law demonstrates this. It is the law that proves righteousness and unrighteousness, not being a part of the Jewish race. So then justification is available to all because of Jesus, not just Israel, because it's not the law that saves. Then we turn to chapters 9 through 11. This is where Paul really wrestles with the strange disconnect between God being completely concerned with Israel in the Old Testament and then not really seeming to fulfill those promises for the New Testament. It seems this way because Israel largely rejected Jesus, and their acceptance of Jesus should have been the way that all of those Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled. So, did God fail? Paul challenges the idea that God hasn't been faithful to keep his promises. Paul has 2 main reasons to argue his point. Firstly, God's promise was never to all of Israel. God has always kept a remnant of those who are faithful to him for himself. God's promises to Israel have little to do with race or with a census of the country. It has to do with Israel as a spiritual identity, not a racial identity. Therefore, if God is keeping his promises to the faithful remnant, which he is, then God is indeed fulfilling his promises to Israel. As Paul says, not all are Israel who are descended from Israel. Paul's second argument against the idea that God has been unfaithful to Israel is that even if not all are Israel who are descended from Israel, God still does plan to save the entire nation one day, just not at that time and seemingly not for the next 2,000 years either. But why wait? What could possibly be the benefit of God's chosen people rejecting God's salvation? Wouldn't it be better for everyone to just accept the gift of Jesus Christ? This is a huge question that we still wrestle with as moderners. Most American Protestant churches are concerned with salvation above all else, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Being right before God and standing to gain eternity with him is certainly the most important issue. However, applications of this belief often oversimplify God's purposes. While many of us think in terms of this cosmic battle between belief and unbelief, and we categorize wins as gaining more souls and losses as failing to gain souls, God's plans are more complicated than this. Paul's argument in Romans 11 highlights this problem in our thinking. Paul looks to the Old Testament to validate his second thesis. God uses the hardening of people's hearts to himself as a part of his salvation purposes. This is a subject that causes a lot of people to stumble over their own theology. How could God harden someone to himself and thus prevent their salvation? And the answer requires a great deal of faith to believe in. Hardening is used to achieve a greater salvation. God's wondrous hand in the Exodus only occurred because Pharaoh was hardened. In the case of salvation by Jesus Christ, Israel's hardening is what paved the way for Gentiles to be saved. Paul uses the imagery of an olive tree. It says that the people of Israel are like branches that have been cut off for their unfruitfulness. Then, God grafted into their place the wild olives, or the Gentiles that God has graciously made a place for. But then, God also plans to then graft in the original branches and make the tree even more full and glorious than it was naturally. Therefore, the wild branches ought not to be conceded against the natural branches which have been cut off. Ideally, we all get to share each other as family. Romans 11:25 through 27 is then where Paul states his main point in saying all of this to the church in Rome. For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. And then Paul quotes two Old Testament prophecies mashed together to demonstrate that God's promise to Israel still stands. Let's break down what this passage means a little bit. Firstly, Paul describes the situation as a mystery. Mystery is a powerful word that really dramatizes everything that Paul is talking about. Truly, God's plan here is mysterious. It doesn't make sense to us without Paul explaining it here. Now, how could we hope to understand God intentionally hardening people apart from Paul making sense of it all in this passage? God's plans for Israel were a mystery until the Bible revealed it here. In fact, let's talk about that too. Did God harden Israel, or did a hardening merely happen to Israel? Is it even okay for God to harden someone? Blazing says this: most theological discussions are concerned with identifying the agent of the hardening, and opinion is divided between God as the sole agent, strict Calvinism, and man as solely responsible, Arminianism. I would suggest that whether humans do it to themselves or God inflicts it upon them is then largely irrelevant. What matters is that God uses it for his salvation purposes. In the case of Israel at the time of Paul's writing, whether God has caused their hardening or merely counted on it, Paul assures his readers that this apparent complication is neither beyond God's plan, nor is it permanent. Most importantly, we need to understand the purpose of this plan. God is doing this, using the hardening of Israel, as part of his plan to rescue the whole world. That includes Israel and everyone else too. Paul wants his readers to rest assured that God has an epic plan which will save many Gentiles and the nation of Israel, and that we need to have faith that this is what God is working towards and simply trust him in it. So what does all of this mean for modern Christians like us? Well, first of all, it requires faith from us. We need to understand that God uses the hardening of people for his own salvation purposes. That may seem illogical to us, but we need to have faith that God's perfect plan is far better than ours. However strange it may seem to us, we need to trust that God is doing a miraculous work in his world to save humanity. Secondly, this passage really dictates how we relate to Israel. It explains why Israel is so predominant in the Old Testament and why it feels like there's a disconnect with the Old Testament on one side and the New Testament and modern Christian life on the other. Israel is not some forgotten relic of the Old Testament that only served to give God something to write about in the Bible for us to learn from today. No, quite the opposite. Israel is still an integral part of God's plan. But contrary to what we might assume, God is using their hardening to fuel his gracious extension of mercy to people outside of Israel. Therefore, here's what we need to do better as American Christianity. We need to have a heart for Israel and relate to them when we're reading about them. That includes reading about them in the Bible and reading about them in the news. Israel is a really important country and people. We can't forget about them. Yes, they may be hardened to the gospel, but their hardening now and their acceptance later are both part of God's amazing plan for them and for us. The worst thing we can do is feel as though we are superior to Israel because we've been chosen and they've been rejected. Rather, we need to be excited for their eventual return to the family of God. After all, if their transgression is riches for the world and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? God is using their hardening to fuel his gracious extension of grace. Bad writing.